We're now on Daf Lamed Zayin Amid Beis. Ach Chilek. The pasuk says, "V'lakachta chameshes shkolim lagulgoles," and the Torah adds the word Ach. Let me read the pasuk. Ach pado tifde es b'char ha'adam v'chule v'chule, and Ach is always a chilek, and it divides it into two. And basically, what it's telling us is that there's a normal firstborn that reaches the age of 30, and then there's this baby that unfortunately tragically was killed, and now it doesn't reach age 30. And the pasuk is teaching us that not every single bechar needs pidyon. And we're going to exclude the baby that doesn't reach its 30th day, even though it had the physical ability to reach the 30th day. There was nothing unhealthy about the baby. Now, what does that have to do with the question of a baby with two heads? You're talking about a baby that was murdered before age 30 days, and doesn't have to be redeemed. What in the world does that have to do with a case of a baby born with two heads? So Tosas therefore reinterprets the Gemara, and he says that we're not talking about a baby that was murdered, but nitraf means the baby became a treifa. And if the baby became a treifa, then the pasuk is telling me that it doesn't require pidyon, because it's not a viable being. And therefore Tosas says that if you have a baby born with two heads and they're both struggling, to take over the heartbeat and the breathing and so forth and so on, then it's basically similar to a treifa. Therefore, there's no chiyuv of pidyon haben. So Gemara answers, Shiny Hacha, don't bring any proof from the baby that was killed before 30 days, because that's not comparable to the two-headed baby. The Torah says, and this was a pasuk we quoted before, chameshes shkolim ligulgoles, for the head. And the Torah specifies that the pidyon has to be on the gulgoles, on the head, like counting the head. And therefore, in the case of a father of a two-headed child, he's got to pay 5 shekels, meaning 10 shekels. 10 sloim, I should say. Omar Mar Yodcha Zuki Bores. How do you know that the word Yodcha doesn't mean that you have to put the tefillin on your yad, but rather you have to put it on the bicep? To Tanur Rabbanu, we learned in the Brisa Yodcha Zu Govesh Biyad, that the word Yodcha has to be interpreted on the higher part of the arm, which is the bicep. Ata Omer Zu Govesh Biyad Oeno El Yodcha Mamish. Maybe it means put the tefillin on the yad. Omer Torah, the Torah says Hanach tefillin biyad, Vanach tefillin barosh, and we have an equation now between tefillin shel yad and tefillin shel rosh. Malahal, and just like in the case of tefillin shel rosh, it's got to be begova harosh, on the high part of the head. So to afkan begova shebiyad, in the case of tefillin shel yad, it has to be begova, the high part of the arm, which is the bicep. Later on, the Gemara is going to ask, how do you know that when it says totafos beinei necha, it doesn't mean beinei necha literally, but it means the gova shel barosh? Rabbi Eliezer ben Tzarech, if you want to derive that the tefillin shel yad has to be on the bicep, I don't need your drasha from equating it with tefillin shel rosh. Harehu omer v'hayil chala os. What does it mean lechala os? It's a sign for you. Lechali os v'lo lacherim li os. No one else sees your tefillin. Tefillin are covered by your garment. If you would put it on your hand, then it's for everybody in os. Everybody sees it. And therefore, we derive the conclusion that the tefillin has to be on the bicep, where you cover the tefillin with your garment. Rabbi Yitzchak Omer Ein Tzarech. Rabbi Yitzchak says I can derive the conclusion about the bicep for Tefillin Shel Yad from a different pasuk. Harei Omer v'samtem es dvarai eile alavavchem ukshartem. In the same pasuk, it mentions the lave, the heart, and the kshira of the Tefillin Shel Yad. And therefore, we learn the conclusion that Tehei Sima Keneged Alev, that it should be opposite the heart, which is going to be the bicep. The hand obviously is not opposite the heart, and therefore it's got to be placed on the bicep. I don't know if you ever heard of the Chabita Rav. The Chabita Rav was asked the following question. Apparently, a boy was born, and believe it or not, his heart was not on the left side, but rather on the right side. And since we say that the tefillin has to be Keneged Alev, maybe, just one second, maybe I got it wrong. The heart, Keneged Alev, and his heart was over there. So maybe he should be putting his tefillin on the right side, which is Keneged Alev. So he said, no, Keneged Alev means, for most people, where the heart is located. Anyway, Rabbi Chiva Rav Acha Brei Rav Avya Mikevan Umonach Le Bahadi Libe. So the son of Rav Avya would place his tefillin shel yad opposite his heart. Rav Ashi Avi Yosef Kami Da Memar. By the way, opposite his heart means that the bias of the tefillin should be bent a little bit inwards towards his heart, not facing the sky. Now, Rav Ashi was sitting before Amemar, and he noticed that Avitzire Biyode, that Amemar had a tear in his garment, which means that his tefillin were exposed. To come as chazin tefillin. Amalei, so Rav Ashi said to him, we don't expose at tefillin shel yad. Why did you expose the tefillin shel yad? What I understand is that the place where the tefillin is normally covered, but not that this halacha that the tefillin shel yad have to be exposed. Gova shebarosh minolan. Now we come back to the question. You derive gova shebiyad from gova shebarosh. How do you know that the tefillin shel rosh have to be on the top of the head? The Ton Rabbanon beinei necha zu gova shebarosh. Hatomer zu gova shebarosh. Oh, eino el beinei necha mamish. If I'm not mistaken, we once took a tour to the the caves on the way down to Yam HaMelech, where they discovered a lot of stuff from the period of the Essenes, from the period of the Tzdukim, and so forth and so on. And it seems that the Tzdukim actually wore their tefillin between the eyes, here on the forehead. Anyway, how do we know? The Torah says that you're not allowed to, if let's say somebody died and a deceased and you want to show your anguish and your grief, you're not allowed to pull out the hairs from the top of your head where they meet the forehead. And in both cases, the Torah used the term beinei necha or beinei nechem. And therefore, we derive the conclusion, malahalim begova shebarosh, right? It's got to be on the scalp where he could rip out hairs, right? There are no hairs here on the forehead. Is makom shel sekoch. Afkan here too in tefillin begova shel rosh. And then again, let's just reiterate that from the fact that we know that tefillin shel rosh has to be begova shel barosh, therefore, by equation and analogy, we derive the conclusion that tefillin shel yad have to be begova shel hayad. Now, let's make the following point: the tefillin shel barosh have to be put on the gova shel barosh, the front part of the scalp, but only where hair is growing. I see some people, the tefillin start, and mine also, if I'm not careful about it, they start moving downwards, and part of the tefillin is on the forehead where there's no hair. And once part of the tefillin are not in the right place, then the entire mitzvah of tefillin is completely undermined. So before we were mentioning how complicated it is to find the exact place for your tefillin shel yad, but we also have to be very meticulous about where we put the tefillin shel rosh. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ein tzarich. Rabbi Yehuda says I have a different source from which I derive the conclusion that the tefillin shel rosh have to be not beinei necha mamish, but rather begova shel rosh. And now we're going to learn it from Tumas Tsaras. And we'll see soon that there are two categories of Tumas Tsaras. Amra Torah, the Torah says, Hanach tefillin biyad, Hanach tefillin b'rosh, Mala halon. Right, we have these two mitzvahs of tefillin shel b'rosh and tefillin shel biyad. Mala halon, just like in the case of tefillin shel biyad, it's makom aroyli tami b'nega. It can only be contaminated by one of two possible categories of tzaras, as we'll soon see. Is so too here too with tefillin shel rosh. Afkan b'mokum aroyli tam v'nega echad lafuki b'nei echad de'ika basar v'seir de'ika seir lavan de'ika seir tzahov. So there are two types and categories of tzaras. There's something called seir lavan, and that's white hair, and something called seir tzahov, which literally is yellow hair. Now, when you see this phenomenon called tzaras, is it a phenomenon of tzaras that's mitame or not? So it depends where the affliction is. There's part of the skin that's exposed, and in such a case, it's nega lavan, which means it's what we said before, se'ar lavan. It's the white hair that's in the exposed part. However, there's also something called se'ar tzahov. What is se'ar tzahov? Se'ar tzahov is the skin that's covered by hair or by the beard. And then in such a case, if the tzaras appears in that location of the body where the skin is covered by hair, then the nega tzaras is going to be tzahov. Now the Brisa says that when you put the tefillin shel yad, and again we have Gzeira Shav between shel yad and shel rosh. So on the on tefillin, there's only one possibility of nega tzaras, namely tzaras lavan, right? Nega seir lavan. Now I think what's going on here is that just try to understand why there's only seir lavan. Right, because the skin is not covered by hair. I think that's fair. Do you agree with me that the skin of the arm is not covered by hair? So it's not covered by hair. Then we said there's only one possibility of nega tzaras, and that's called seir lavan. And based on the Gzeira Shava, then tefillin shel rosh would have to be on a place where there's only one possibility of nega. I mean, in this case, it's completely covered by hair, and if it's completely covered by hair, then there's only seir tzahov. Let me just go over that one more time. If the affliction appears on skin covered by hair, then the presence of yellow, right, seir lavan, seir tzahov, is metame b'tumas tzaras. Just give me 1 second here. Wait a minute. Why is it that the arm only has seir lavan? because the arm has no hair, and therefore, okay, I'm sorry, I missed one little point. Let me make the emphasis on the forehead has two types of skin. It has the eyebrows and above the eyebrows, which is pure skin without any hair. So that means that there could be one of two types of negetzaras in the forehead. You can have Seir Lavan and you can have Seir Tzahov. Why? Because Keneged Beinenecha has both types of skin, with hair and without hair, and therefore it's susceptible to two types of tzaras. But in the case of Tefillin Shel Yad, there it's only susceptible to Seir Tzahov. Why? Because there's no hair. And therefore we have to find in Tefillin Shel Rosh a place which is Keneged Beinenecha, but it is only susceptible to one category of the affliction of tzaras, and that's going to be on the scalp with his hair, and it's only susceptible to Seir Lavan. Arba Tzitzios. Now we move to a new topic, and we saw that the Mishnah says Makvazu Zu, you have to have four corners with tzitzis on each of the four corners of bust. Sharabas on mitzvah achas. It's one mitzvah to have tzitzis on four corners. Rabbi Shmuel says no, there are four different mitzvahs. And therefore, on each kanaf, on each corner, you have a separate machayev, separate chiyuv of tzitzis. So that if, let's say, theoretically, you put a pair of tzitzis on one out of the four corners, then you have a kind of mitzvah vis-a-vis that one corner. Whereas according to Chacham, you get nothing. My beinayu, Omer of Yosef, sadin b'tzitzis ika beinayu. So the question of the Gemara, my beinayu, is based on the premise that according to Rabbi Shmuel, even though he says that there are four mitzvahs, he means not that it's each corner is a separate mitzvah, and you could be Makayim tzitzis in that corner alone, but rather it means that all told, after you put on four tzitzios, so four corners, then you get credit for four mitzvahs. But even Rabbi Shmuel agrees that you have to have tzitzis on all four corners. So therefore the Gemara says, so what's the difference now? You're counting up mitzvahs here. Let HaKadosh Baruch Hu count up mitzvahs. Omar Rav Yosef, Sodom b'tzitzis k'beinai. Tanakama would hold that, let's say, he attached tzitzis to three out of the four corners. And if we assume that his beged is made of pishtan, it's made of linen, the tzitzis are made of tzemer, of wool. When he ties down the woolen tzitzis to the beged of pishtan, of linen, then he violates the Isur Kilayim, which is called Sadin B'tzitzis. So according to Tanakama, if he would do this, let's say on one, two, or even three corners, then by attaching wool tzitzis to a linen garment, and he gets no credit for 3 out of 4, then he violated Kilayim 3 times over. Rabbi Shmuel would say that he doesn't violate Kilayim. Why not? So this is very complicated because we said that even according to Rabbi Shmuel, without 4 corners and sits on all 4, you don't fulfill the mitzvah. So therefore, even Rabbi Shmuel should agree that you violate the Isur Kilayim. So I think what you have to say here is that tzitzis is a kiyum in the chefts of the beged. And according to Rabbi Shmuel, each corner is considered a hefta shel beged and generates a chiyuv tzitzis. Hence, when you put on all four, you get 4 mitzvahs, one for each corner. And therefore, even though Rabbi Shmuel would agree that you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah, that's only as far as the kiyum and chovas gavra, but as far as the hefta, each hefta is a hefta shel mitzvah. However, the Gemara offers another approach. Rava Barahina Omar Talis Balas Chameshi Kabinayu. According to Rabbi Shmuel, if you have 5 corners on your beged, which today is pretty common, even 6 corners on your beged, you would require every corner an additional tzitzis. So you would have 5 corners with 5 tzitzios, according to Rabbi Shmuel, where according to Tanakama would hold that the mitzvah of tzitzis is to attach tzitzis to 4 corners, not to 5. Another answer is Ravina. To Rav Huna, Ikabeinayu Diyam Rav Huna, Hayotze Betalis Sheda Mitzuyetzes, Kil Chasa B'Shabbos Chayv Chatos. We say that tzitzis is part of the beged. If it's part of the beged, then there's no masa, there's no carrying of the tzitzis. But if you do not fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis, then it's not part of the beged. It's just attached to the beged, and therefore you're carrying it when you wear it. So if he goes out into a Rishus Harabim, and let's say he only has tzitzis on X, let's say 1, 2, 3 corners, then says Rav Huna is chayav achatos because he's carrying the tzitzis. Whereas according to Rabbi Shmuel, each corner is a separate hefta shel mitzvah. So the hefta shel mitzvah means that there's no kilayim. So even though, again, the Gavra has not fulfilled his obligation until he puts on fringes on all 4 corners, but nevertheless, even on 3 corners, each one is a hefta shel mitzvah, therefore there's no iser of hotzah. Rav Shisha Bered Rav Idi Haiman de Batzre Leglime. He cuts off a corner of his garment. Lo Avid v'lo klum. Shavia Talis Balas Chamesh. You might think that by cutting off a corner of his garment, then he's now potter from tzitzis. Why? Because he only has 3 corners. I have a curveball, says Rav Shisha. It's not that he has 3 corners, but now he has 5 corners. And 5 corners requires tzitzis. Again, does it require tzitzis on all 5 corners like Rabbi Shmuel, or according to Tanakama, only on 4 out of the 5? That's a machlokas, but he definitely requires tzitzis. And by cutting off a corner, he's left with 5 corners instead of 4. Another case of somebody who wanted to mess up his tzitzis in such a way, mess up his beged in such a way he's part of tzitzis. High minded sairi liglime. What he did was he folded back some of the corners or one of the corners of his 4-cornered garment, and by folding it back, he made it around instead of a 90-degree angle. Even though he knotted the corners of his beged, but nevertheless, he can easily untie the knots, and therefore it's considered still as if that corner still exists. So he did not successfully exempt himself from tzitzis. Utna, now we learned in a Mishnah, he tells you here that this Mishnah is a Mishnah, the 26th parak of Kilayim. Okay, so when you sign up for a yard site, you might want to think twice before you sign up for Mishnah's Kilayim. Anyway, so the Mishnah says, Kol chamosos, hatzruros tahoros. Okay, this has to do with Kabbalas Tumah in a kli that's made of leather, right? It's called chamosos, hatzruros. In other words, tzuros means they knot the flask on the bottom, and it's tar. And the reason for that, the Tara here is because when it comes to leather kalim, leather utensils, they only contract tuma if there's a cavity that could serve as a receptacle. But now, if it's not loose, but rather he tied it up, then by stitching it up on the bottom, it's no longer receptacle. If it's not, it doesn't have a kli kibul, it's not makabel tuma. But the exception is shel arvin, right? Flasks that are owned by the Arabs. So what does that mean? So although the flasks are only folded over and knotted at the bottom, they are nevertheless susceptible to because this is how they normally make it. So in other words, you know, if you tie up one end and now the cavity is very limited, but if that's how they make it, then it's makabel tuma. Okay, fine. This has nothing to do with asugya per se, but the Gemara apparently goes off on a little bit of a tangent. Okay. Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbos and Arba Mitzvah. Some Rabbi Yudalachik, Rabbi Shmuel, Veles Hilchas Kavose. We don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, the name of Shmuel, like Rabbi Shmuel, but rather we paskin like the Tanakama. Okay. Ravina. Ravina, Havika Ozil, Abasri, Demabra Avashi, Vishabsu the Regila. Right? It was the Shabbos of Regila. Regila means of a regel, and they used to give a special drasha on the Shabbos of the regel. But ifsik karna dechute, the fringes of Mar Bar Avashi's garment are off, and Mar Bar Avashi was unaware of this. V'lo Omer Levlo Midi Ravina didn't tell it. Kadmotel Beise when Mar Bar Avashi came home, Omer Ravina said to me, Hosam ifsik. Right? You were en route to a certain location to give you a drasha, and it was torn. Amalei, iamartali mehasam shadise. Had you told me exactly there where you discovered that the fringes were cut off, I would have taken off the garment. Frekti Gemara v'hamar mar gadol kavod abriya shedochas lo sesh b'torah Gemara brachos tafchav. That kavod abriya is docha. That if Mar Bar Avashi did not have to humiliate himself publicly by removing his garment, even though some of the tzitzis were cut off, were torn off. And truth is that even had he been notified about the fringes, he would not have to take off his garment. He would have kavod abrios, right, preserving the dignity, and that would have superseded the Easter of carrying on Shabbos. And the Gemara answers Tegamur of Bar Avashi Kadmeider of Kahana. Here we'll just Bilav de lo sasur. Okay, now what time is it? Let me just see if so we might be able to finish the perek. Lav de lo tasur. What happens over here? We say that if you're shevi al taseh and you're passive, then you can violate a lav passively for the sake of preserving dignity. However, what happens in the case of carrying on Shabbos? Here, kavod abrios could not override the violation of Shabbos. Meaning, had Ravina told Mar Bar Avashi that his tzitzis tore off, then Mar Bar Avashi would have been obligated to remove his cloak, notwithstanding the fact that he would be publicly disgraced by stripping, by taking off his clothes. Because when we talk about a lav, which the Gemara, projects lo tasur, then you can't override a lav based on kavod abrios. Ika de amri mehasam amole. Actually, Ravina in the story told Mar Rav Ashi immediately that his tzutzis tore off. The Amar Le, Mar Rav Ashi said to him, "My dait mishte, do I have to strip and take off the garment because it has four corners and it doesn't have proper tzitzis?" So the Gemara says that Mar Rav Ashi said that I don't have to take off the garment. In fact, the Gemara of Atirgama of Rav Bar Shava Kameder of Kahana Belav Delotasa. In other words, only in a case of Lotasu, when you can violate Lotasu b'Shevi Alta, said then you docha covered abrios. But in this case of carrying on Shabbos, we're talking about something that's lehedja, it's explicit in the Torah. Well, it's not exactly explicit, but it's almost explicit. And therefore, Ravina was justified in informing Mar Rav Ashi that his tzitzit had torn because he was obligated to remove his garment immediately. So the Gemara says, "Ochanami v'karmelis terabanan he," that even in the case of a violation of a lotas, if it's not doraisa but only derabanan, for example, carrying in a karmelis, in such a case we say gavad kol abrios, and therefore Mar Rav Ashi would not have been obligated to take off his garment publicly and humiliate himself. Hadran Olecha, Perek HaKometz. And the Mitzvah Hashem will start the fourth Perek tomorrow. I think at 12 noon, if I got that right. Have a great day.